Today is Friday, January 31st, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Trump blasts DEI initiatives in a presser on the DC air crash. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us as well. We'd love to hear from you. quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. That's our email address, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. We're getting through the news of the Cray here each and every weekday, bright and early. And joining me today, help us get through it, CBN's Billy Hallowell and Madison Seals. And Madison, on the Focus story, some good news of a pastor finally getting home.
Yeah, this Ryan Corbett was on a business trip and ended up being held by the Taliban for 894 days. So this is a long-awaited release, to say the least, and praise the Lord.
Yeah, a crazy story there. We'll get the details in a minute. Looking forward to that. On the main thing, Billy, you caught up with, this is about as unlikely as a testimony as you're going to hear. Charlie Sheen's daughter.
Yeah, Lola Sheen. She's 19 years old, and she is a Christian now, and a really solid one. So we had a chance to connect with her and tell her story.
Yeah, God doing always. I feel like he shows off sometimes, right? Like the most unlikely scenarios from, that whole background and everything. So looking forward to that conversation there and hearing that testimony a little bit. And make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, DC Debrief, John Stolnis, Newsmakers with Billy, and Jesus and the Prophecies of Christmas, our 4-part series. You can check that out. All the links to all of those are in the description of this podcast episode. All right, and with that, we are going to head to the news in 90 seconds. And Kash Patel, Trump's pick to lead the FBI, faced Senate confirmation hearings yesterday, and they focused on a wide range of issues on FBI misconduct, Patel's political views, and some past controversial quotes. He's a former public defender, Obama-era terrorism prosecutor, and a key figure in exposing Russia collusion claims. Senator Josh Hawley questioned Patel about the FBI's memo targeting radical traditional Catholics, quote unquote. The memo suggested Catholic parishes could be sites for recruiting FBI informants, and Hawley asked him to look into this, and he said if he's confirmed, he would. He also talked about the FBI raid on pro-life activist Mark Houck, and he criticized that as well, and looking to see if Patel will indeed look into these abuses and more. And that tragic midair collision in Washington, D.C. has left no survivors. 64 people on the American Airlines passenger jet collided with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter. Rescuers now are going into recovery mode. 28 bodies as of yesterday recovered, and the victim lists are starting to come out. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can go over to cbnnews.com for more. And the pilot of that American Airlines plane, guys, is a 28-year-old Sam Lilly. And the incredible thing there is that his dad, Sam Lilly's dad, was a military helicopter pilot for 20 years. So what a crazy just bit of irony there in this, amidst this tragedy, but just horrible. The reports are that he was engaged. And then just on a personal note, when I was looking through the pictures of these victims, I immediately recognized one of the crew. And it was because I recently was on a similar flight, one of those same planes, those American Eagle smaller ones. And I remembered the flight attendant, this guy named Ian, because he was really funny. He was a former comedian, and I kind of sat in the middle. I had my whole family with us, and he kind of, being a comedian, you single somebody out in the crowd, and he sort of picked on us and was just making jokes about how many kids we had and all this stuff, and it was really funny. So he had everybody laughing, funny guy. And man, he was on that as well. And his picture popped up just yesterday, and seeing that, man, that was, the whole thing is tragic, but, just starting to see, and this is always painful in these tragedies, you start seeing people's lives, and, it gets really personal at this point. So really tragic all around.
Yeah, that must have sent a chill down your spine, to having had that experience.
Really did.
And I think this is just when these moments happen, it puts everything in perspective. It forces us to think about life and what really matters. And, all those people probably thinking about their plans, tomorrow, the next day, getting off the plane, people meeting them at the airport. And in a split second, life can change. And it's just, I think, a shocking reminder for everybody in the midst of the horror that we don't know that tomorrow's guaranteed.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard to think that there might even still be some families of people who are on the plane who haven't received the news yet. I know, as of 12 hours after the incident, there were parents who were waiting at the airport, who were expecting their family members to land. They were just minutes from landing. And I know at least one text had been sent from a wife to her husband. The wife was on board and she said, "We're landing in about 20 minutes." And he sent a text back that never made it through. And so you're right. It's tragic because we never know how long we have, but also in a place as highly secure and airspace is highly secure as DC, for something like this to happen, I think just boggles people's mind. And the sad thing is, there's a lot of people expressing that in the media. Even our president has expressed that. How does this happen? And those questions are being politicized. And the truth is, there's a lot of questions, understandably, because we don't want this to happen again.
Right.
And so it sounds like there's so many teams on the ground working to figure out everything. And so we just need to be lifting up everybody involved, including the first responders, the families of those affected, and the communities of the people affected.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things President Trump in his press conference yesterday, he really, after expressing his condolences and in that statement, he really kind of went in on DEI and how the last 4 years the administration had really elevated DEI, and that's something that has been promoted in all areas of the federal government from the Biden administration. And so I think they're going to be looking to see if there was any influence on that, where there was concerns, that people maybe that weren't fully qualified for certain air traffic control roles were hired because of this. And I'm sure they'll find all that out in the investigation. But that was certainly one thing of point of focus for President Trump on his press conference yesterday. But we'll keep you up to date with all of the latest developments in this story. Obviously, a big tragedy, and people are going to be searching for answers here for some time, and we'll continue praying. We're going to go to the focus story now. And as we mentioned at the top, a pastor, man, on a business trip ends up in the hands of the Taliban. Who's Ryan Corbett, and how in the world did he end up in this situation?
Yeah, well, Ryan Corbett is a U.S. citizen from New York, and he and his family first visited Afghanistan in 2006 before they eventually moved there in January 2010. And at the time of their move, they had two small daughters, and Ryan's wife, Anna, was pregnant with their son. So the reason they moved there is that Ryan ran and supervised projects for several non-governmental organizations that focused on education as well as birth and life-saving skills. And then after receiving his MBA, Ryan decided that the best way for the Afghan community to prosper would be by helping Afghans start and operate their own businesses. So in 2017, Ryan started Bloom Afghanistan, which is a social enterprise focused on strengthening Afghanistan's private sector. So in many ways, the Afghan people became family to Ryan and his wife Anna and their kids. So they were devastated when they had to evacuate for their own family's safety in 2021 because of the Taliban's reemergence in August of 2021. So they moved back to the States, and then Ryan kept operating his business from abroad. And then in August of 2022, Ryan returned to Afghanistan on a valid 12-month visa to pay and train his staff. And on August 10th of that year, Ryan and his German colleague were detained by the Taliban. He wasn't charged with any crime, so the only suspected reason is their value as political leverage, political prisoners. And the two Afghans who were originally detained with them were released in September of 2022, so later that same year. And then Ryan's German colleague was released in December of that year. But Ryan was held by the Taliban in a basement cell since August 10th, 2022. And other released Western detainees who were held in the same conditions as Ryan reported that he was in poor health and without access to adequate medical care, and for much longer than they were. So in September of 2023, the U.S. State Department determined that Ryan is being wrongfully detained in Afghanistan. And it wasn't until January 21st of this year, 2025, that Ryan was finally released as part of a swap in which an Afghan national convicted of drug smuggling and extremism in the U.S. was sent back to Afghanistan. So thankfully, he is out and Ryan is back here stateside.
What are his family and friends saying about his return?
Well, it's incredible to see someone who had been captured for nearly 900 days come home. That's just a long time to hold out hope that they'll be returned safe. And yet, when it's family, it's never too long to hope. And so his family was hoping and they were praying. And Ryan's pastor, David Theobald, actually spoke out about it, saying that he's rejoicing with Ryan's family in Texas and crediting God's timing for the safe release. And he described a lengthy period when only a few individuals knew of Ryan's initial capture. And he said, we'd been walking with him, that with his family through this for about a year before the media caught wind of it and really started circulating his story. And the pastor said the church played a huge role in providing emotional support for Ryan's family. So for months, the family had to deal with this in silence and found peace through Grace Baptist Church in that community. And he credited the family for staying involved in worship activities and noted that Ryan's children sing and play instruments and assist in the sound booth. And even Ryan's wife, Anna, teaches violin and has performed at church events while he was away. So now that Ryan is back, he spent his first hours back on U.S. soil with close family members after his arrival early last Wednesday morning. And his family later issued a statement, of course, expressing their gratitude for his release and thankfulness for all of the prayers, but also requesting privacy while he recovers from everything that he's been through.
That really had to be agonizing when they couldn't really say what was going on, for safety reasons and everything else. I mean, gosh, that had to be horrible. I mean, I can't imagine because, you're, especially a church family, you're looking for your congregation to pray with you and to help in those times. And if you had to keep a certain amount of that or all of it, under wraps, man, that had to be brutal.
Yeah. And what do you tell your kids too? I mean, I know that you guys are both dads and probably can't imagine trying to explain to your kids when one of their parents is going to return home because you don't know either.
Yeah.
And for his wife to have to be strong through that time and try to keep their lives as normal as possible while also balancing her own need for emotional support. That's something that, you can only handle with the mercy and grace of our Lord Jesus. So I'm thankful that she had that to hold on to with all her might.
Yeah, what a what a crazy story. And I think it's evidence of not giving up hope either, because that's a long time to be detained. And we've seen this again and again in these stories of, families who don't give up hope. As Christians, knowing the importance of hope, you're not always going to get the end that you want, but that does seem to be an essential ingredient to finding success for those who do. And in this case, thank God for the conclusion of this. But yeah, the part with the kids, that's the part that there's so many layers in a story like this we don't often think about.
Yeah. And then the dynamic too. I mean, it's great that he's home, but then it makes you wonder, like, are they going to be incentivized now because they get one of these extremist guys in return? And then that person goes back out. And so obviously not a fair swap, right? This guy who's a pastor trying to help people, and then, some extremist crazy person gets released in this swap. So hopefully it doesn't incentivize more of that sort of behavior going on. But, what are you going to do? You want to get the guy home. So it's sometimes a necessary evil, but nevertheless, glad that he's home, glad that he made it out of there alive. And it's really cool work that he's doing. So hopefully he's able to somehow continue that in some way, shape, or form, even if he decides to never step foot in Afghanistan again, which I really wouldn't blame him if he did that. So great story. Happy ending to that story. Not a great story that he went through, but a great ending to that story. Appreciate you bringing it to the podcast today, Madison. And we're going to head to the main thing now. And Lola Sheen, who's the daughter of actors Charlie Sheen and Denise Richards, joined Billy for today's main thing to discuss her path to faith.
What was that moment for you where you realized, or was it more of a journey? And talk a little bit about, I know there was a moment where it really snapped, so I guess talk about that, but if there's a journey, feel free to share it.
Thank you so much. So I actually went to a Catholic middle school, and I would go to church, and like I remember I said it was very like I just went because I had to at school, and it was never actually like I wanted to go because, I wanted to get closer to Jesus. And so I basically, I never ever followed God. Like when I was like 16 and in my like, after I graduated that middle school, in high school, the thought of Jesus just never came to my mind. It wasn't something I was against. I just never thought of it. You know what I mean?
It just wasn't there in front of you.
Exactly.
It wasn't something you were thinking of. Yeah.
Right. It wasn't
as a compass, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And none of my friends also that I was around were following Jesus. And so it's so crazy because when I was 18, that's when I say like everything changed, because for some reason, right when I turned 18, everything just went downhill. I don't know like what happened, but yeah, I was really, really struggling. And also depression is something that it almost felt like I was battling my own mind, and I felt like I just was in these chains of depression and anxiety. And I just was always trying to hang on to a little bit of faith somehow. And I would look for security in my friends, like when I was going through this hard time, or I would go to the beach and I would get a second of like temporary relief. But then I would come home and I'm like, what do I do now? And so
it starts all over again,
Yeah,
right? Because it was like a
again.
temporary distraction almost,
Yes.
right? From what you were feeling. Yeah.
So
yeah.
true. And that's something that was so hard for me because I was like, I don't have any foundation. I don't have eternal like hope. It was just very like temporary. And so this one night I was in my bed and I remember having very just hopeless thoughts about my life. I was like, okay, why am I here if I'm just struggling so bad? And at the time, like, I always saw my friends and I was like, how are they so happy? Obviously, I don't know what goes on behind closed doors, but they all seemed like they were in such a good place. And the thing about this period of my life is no one knew I was struggling. And I didn't tell anybody, I think because I just felt so hopeless. I was like, I feel like anything anyone says right now is just not going to help me. And sometimes I would tell people about it, but I would feel so unheard. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
I just kept quiet. And this one night, I remember I was struggling really bad with nightmares as well. And so it got to a point where I wasn't sleeping. It was just like I was just so anxious. And I was laying down and I remember having such just terrible thoughts. I was like, I honestly just don't want, it's so sad, but I was like, I just don't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to, I just really did not see the point of me.
You were just hopeless. You were ultimately at, like when you say rock bottom, there's no hope in that moment.
Yeah.
I understand that.
Yeah. Thank you. And I wrote this down and I always say this, but I really don't know how else to put it except the fact that Jesus came in my room. It was like I had never experienced anything like it. His presence came to me, and I think it was around like 12. And I felt this overwhelming sense of peace in my room. And I remember I saw a clip, this Christian influencer, her name is Ali Yost, and I always say is the reason why I think I got saved, because I saw a video of her the day before. It came up on my TikTok and it was her talking about Jesus. So the thought of Jesus kind of was in my mind the day before. And then I think that's what opened the door to let him in. because I always say he's a gentleman. He's not going to barge into your life. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I think once I started to think about him, the next night, that's when he came to me. And it really felt like he took my hand and just said, I am here to rescue you and try this again now with me. And so, yeah. And I remember I went to bed that night feeling Jesus so close to me. And I just, like, to explain this to someone who's not Christian, whenever I tell my story to some people who aren't believers, it sounds crazy. But there's nothing like the presence of God. I always say this. There's just nothing like it. And yeah, and so the next morning, it's so funny because I had no idea what I was doing. I was like, okay, where do I start, Jesus? How do I start following you? I don't even know anything.
How do I pray?
Yeah.
How do
I pray? So I looked up, how do I give my life to Jesus? And I said this prayer, Lord, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know that I just met you. And I want to give my entire life to you. And I did. And slowly but surely, Jesus carried me through everything I was going through. And it was such an intimate time with Jesus because he was the only one I had. And so every day I would wake up and I was like, okay, what are we doing today? How are you gonna, get me through today? And I always say that what I went through was such a blessing in my life because the way that I got to know the Lord, and it was just such a special, sacred time. And so, yeah, ever since then, my life really was forever changed.
All right, Billy, thanks for that conversation there. Really good stuff. Always great to hear a testimony, and I love seeing God move in the most unlikely of places, right? Out of Charlie Sheen, given the shenanigans that we've seen from him over the years, just kind of acting out and acting a little crazy. Great to see that God's working even in the midst of that. All right, and that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
Yeah, today we are looking at 1 Thessalonians 4:7. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. And we see that in Lola Sheen's story and so many of our own stories as well. Just an important verse for us to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what a calling. It's not just for God's glory, but for our good as well. Being called to live a holy life is for our good. And that's why the Lord calls us to that. It's why he helps us along the way with that.
Amen. Great spot to leave it for this week. As always, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back here on Monday with more. Until then, have a fantastic weekend. God bless.